Hey guys, tonight we dive into the dust-choked, bullet-riddled world of Wild West law enforcement. From tin badges that meant everything and nothing to showdowns at high noon that were more about paperwork than pistols, being a sheriff wasn't just about justice, it was about survival, politics, and hoping your deputy didn't shoot you by accident. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe pour yourself something strong, and let's ride into tonight's journey together. You're standing on the main street of Deadwood, South Dakota. Your boots caked with mud that's probably half horse manure. Your badge, a piece of tin cut from a tomato can, catches the morning sun, and you're nursing the kind of headache that only comes from breaking up 3 saloon fights and discovering your jail cell door doesn't actually lock. You're not in the mood for heroics. You're not about to face down the Dalton gang or deliver stirring speeches about justice. No, you need something immediate. Coffee that won't kill you, a moment of peace, and maybe, just maybe, to make it through another day without anyone calling you out for a gunfight. Enter the reality of frontier law enforcement. Think less Wyatt Earp, more exhausted civil servant with a questionable life expectancy. The setup is deceptively simple: 1 badge, 1 gun, and a town full of people who think laws are more like suggestions. No backup, no training academy, no real sense of how to handle a Saturday night when the cattle drive just got paid and every saloon is serving rock gut whiskey like it's communion wine. What's your daily routine? Dealing with drunks who think fighting is a competitive sport, breaking up card games where someone always seems to have 5 aces, investigating mysterious disappearances that might be murder or might just be someone who got tired of frontier life and headed for California, and floating over everything like a ghost you can't shake, the constant knowledge that half the town probably has a better gun than you do. Training? Let's not ask. You got the job because the last sheriff either quit, got shot, or decided that running a general store was considerably less life-threatening. Your qualifications were basically, can you read? Do you own a gun? Are you breathing? If you answered yes to 2 out of 3, congratulations! You're now responsible for law and order in a place where both are in desperately short supply. But the job was real, it paid something, and it came with enough authority to make you feel important right up until someone with a faster draw decided they disagreed with your interpretation of justice. Sheriff's offices were everywhere, especially in boomtowns where every week brought new prospectors, gamblers, and men with mysterious pasts who paid for everything in cash and never quite looked you in the eye. Workers, drifters, cattle hands, and very confused Eastern tourists all found themselves under your jurisdiction, trading respect for your badge in exchange for the hope that someone, anyone, was keeping the complete chaos at bay. And sure, it might get you killed, but when the choices were this or digging ditches in 110-degree heat, you pinned on that badge and hoped it came with some kind of divine protection. You've left the jailhouse with your dignity slightly intact and a coffee stain forming on your vest. You're walking down Main Street now, and you hear that familiar sound: glass breaking, shouting, and what might be gunshots or might just be someone hammering horseshoes. You need to investigate, not because you want to, but because that's literally what they pay you to do. Enter the saloon fight, or as they were known in frontier towns, Tuesday. These weren't elegant affairs, no choreographed punches or dramatic music, just drunk men with too much money, too little sense, and an unshakable belief that their honor required them to beat someone senseless over a card game, a woman, or because someone looked at them funny. You push through the batwing doors and immediately duck as a chair flies past your head. The scene is chaos: overturned tables, broken bottles, and men grappling like their lives depend on it, which they probably do. The bartender is hiding behind the bar, occasionally popping up to shout about the damages. The piano player has fled, leaving a haunting melody of broken keys and shattered dreams. Your job? Stop this, somehow, with minimal bloodshed and maximum authority. You've got a gun, but using it means paperwork, investigations, and probably a very awkward conversation with the town council about why you shot someone over a poker dispute. So instead, you rely on the ancient law enforcement technique of shouting really loud and hoping someone listens. Break it up, you bellow, trying to sound more confident than you feel. Sometimes it works. Sometimes the fighters actually stop, look around sheepishly, and shuffle out like scolded children. But sometimes, and this is where the job gets interesting, someone decides that you're the real problem and that badge of yours needs to be permanently retired. That's when you earn your pay, not through heroic gunfights or clever detective work, but through the delicate art of de-escalation while calculating how fast you can draw your weapon if things go south, which they often do. You've managed to restore order to the saloon more through luck than skill, and now you're back on the street dealing with your next challenge. A merchant is complaining that someone stole his horse, a woman is demanding you arrest her husband for drinking away the grocery money, and the group of cowboys just rode into town looking like they haven't seen soap, civilization, or consequences in about 6 months. Enter the art of frontier diplomacy. Being a sheriff wasn't just about enforcing laws, it was about interpreting them, bending them, and occasionally making them up on the spot. The nearest judge might be 200 miles away, the territorial government was more of a suggestion than a reality, and your legal education consisted of whatever you remembered from that one law book you saw once. Horse theft? That's hanging offense, supposedly, but you've got to catch the thief first, prove they actually stole it, and then convince a jury of their peers, assuming you can find 12 people sober enough to serve. Domestic disputes? Those required the wisdom of Solomon and the patience of a saint, especially when both parties were armed and had very different interpretations of marital law. Public drunkenness was technically illegal, but practically unavoidable. In a town where the main entertainment options were drinking, gambling, and fighting, arresting everyone who'd had a few too many would leave you with an empty town and a very full jail, assuming your jail was actually capable of holding people, which it probably wasn't. So you learn to pick your battles. The merchant's horse might have been borrowed rather than stolen. The domestic dispute might resolve itself once the husband sobered up and remembered he actually liked being married. And those cowboys? As long as they paid for their drinks and didn't shoot anyone important, you could probably overlook the fact that they smelled like they'd been dead for a week. It was justice, frontier style, practical, pragmatic, and occasionally involving a lot of creative interpretation of what exactly constituted law and order in a place where both were relative concepts. Now your day is taking a turn into the genuinely dangerous territory, because if there's one part of being a Wild West sheriff that still makes modern law enforcement grateful for their training, it's this: the showdown. Yes, actual gunfights in the street, usually at high noon because apparently frontier criminals had a flair for the dramatic. But here's the thing, most showdowns weren't like the movies. They weren't elegant affairs with two men pacing off distances while a crowd gathered to watch. No, they were usually sudden, messy, and over before you had time to think about your legacy or deliver any memorable last words. Picture this, you're walking down the street, minding your own business, when someone decides they have a problem with your interpretation of justice. Maybe you arrested their brother, confiscated their whiskey, or had the audacity to suggest that shooting up the church was inappropriate behavior. Whatever the reason, they've decided that the solution is to challenge you to a gunfight. Chill. Your options are limited. Back down, and you lose all authority. Word travels fast in small towns, and a sheriff who won't fight is a sheriff who won't last. Fight, and you might win. You might die, or you might accidentally shoot someone's horse and spend the rest of your brief career explaining why you owe Farmer Johnson $50. The showdown itself was usually brutal and brief. No dramatic countdowns, no elaborate positioning. Just two men with guns, a lot of adrenaline, and the desperate hope that their aim was better than their opponents. Most sheriffs who survived weren't the fastest guns. They were the ones smart enough to take cover, bring backup, or convince someone else to handle the problem. But sometimes, when diplomacy failed and hiding wasn't an option, you found yourself standing in the middle of Main Street, hand hovering over your gun, wondering how exactly your life had led to this moment. The crowd would scatter. Nobody wanted to catch a stray bullet, and suddenly it was just you, your opponent, and the uncomfortable realization that your tombstone was probably going to read something embarrassing. If you survived, you were a hero. If you didn't, well, the town would find another sheriff, probably by Thursday. Either way, the paperwork was someone else's problem. You've somehow managed to survive another week as sheriff, which honestly makes you part of a fairly exclusive club. Your badge is still attached, your gun still works, and you haven't been run out of town on a rail, which counts as a major victory in frontier law enforcement. But here's the kicker. Despite the danger, the terrible pay, and the constant threat of violent death, people actually wanted these jobs. Not because they were easy, but because they offered something most frontier jobs didn't: respect. A sheriff was somebody. You had authority, recognition, and the kind of social status that came with being the person everyone turned to when things went wrong. The pay was modest, maybe $50 a month if the town was prosperous, less if it wasn't. But it came with perks: free room and board, usually above the jail, the right to carry weapons openly, and occasionally the gratitude of citizens who appreciated having someone willing to stand between them and complete chaos. Some sheriffs became legends: Wyatt Earp, Pat Garrett, Wild Bill Hickok, men whose names are still remembered today. But for every famous lawman, there were dozens of others who served quietly, died young, or simply got tired of the stress and moved on to safer careers, like dynamite handling or grizzly bear wrestling. The job attracted all types: former soldiers looking for purpose, drifters seeking stability, and occasionally reformed outlaws who figured they understood criminal thinking better than anyone. What they all shared was a willingness to pin on a badge in a place where that piece of tin made you a target for every drunk, outlaw, and troublemaker within 100 miles. Let's talk about something that Hollywood never quite gets right: the paperwork. Yes, even in the Wild West, being a sheriff meant drowning in bureaucracy that would make a modern DMV employee weep with recognition. You couldn't just shoot someone and walk away whistling. There were reports to file, witnesses to interview, and territorial governments that demanded detailed explanations for every bullet spent and every prisoner fed. Picture this. You've just survived a gunfight with a cattle rustler who decided your jail wasn't secure enough for his liking. He's dead, you're alive, and half the town saw it happen. Victory, right? Wrong. Now comes the fun part: explaining to the territorial marshal why you shot a man, providing a detailed account of events, and somehow making it sound like you followed proper procedure in a place where proper procedure was whatever kept you breathing. The forms were nightmarish. Incident reports that asked for details no sane person would remember while dodging bullets. At what time did the deceased draw his weapon? Well, it was sometime between when he called me a yellow-bellied snake and when I realized I didn't want to be a deceased sheriff. Were there any witnesses to corroborate your account? Sure, there was Drunk Pete, Crazy Mary, and a dog that may or may not have been paying attention. Then came the financial paperwork. Every prisoner had to be fed, and the town expected detailed receipts. Beans, 15 cents. Hardtack, 10 cents. Bandages for the prisoner who tried to escape through a window and discovered that iron bars are harder than human skulls, 25 cents. Coffee to keep yourself awake while guarding said prisoner, 20 cents, and worth every penny. Equipment requisitions were their own special hell. Need a new gun because yours jammed during a critical moment? Fill out Form 23B, get 3 signatures from town council members who may or may not be sober, and wait 6 weeks for approval. Need bullets? Same process, but add a detailed explanation of why you can't just whittle your own ammunition from wood scraps. And God help you if there was a death in custody. Even if the prisoner died from natural causes, like old age, disease, or the overwhelming realization that he'd made some poor life choices, you were filling out paperwork until your fingers bled. Cause of death, time of death, next of kin notification, property inventory, and a detailed explanation of why this wasn't somehow your fault. The territorial government loved its statistics. How many arrests this month? What types of crimes? Average length of incarceration. They wanted reports that read like a frontier census, complete with charts and graphs that you had to draw by hand because Excel wouldn't be invented for another century. But here's the kicker. Most sheriffs couldn't read or write well enough to handle this bureaucratic nightmare. So they either learned fast, found a deputy who could spell, or developed a creative relationship with the truth that would make a politician proud. The prisoner escaped sounded much better than, "I forgot to lock the door and he walked out while I was napping." Now let's dive into something that would make modern law enforcement training look like a gentle yoga class. Learning to be a sheriff through trial and very public error. There was no police academy, no 6 months of classroom instruction, no psychological evaluations. If you wanted to be a sheriff, you generally just had to convince enough people that you were the least likely to get them all killed. Your training consisted of whatever the previous sheriff had time to tell you before he fled town, quit, or achieved room temperature. Sometimes this was valuable information. Don't trust anyone who pays for drinks with gold coins but can't afford a bath. Sometimes it was less helpful. The jail door sticks, the town drunk knows how to pick locks, and Mrs. Henderson makes terrible coffee but excellent pies, so be diplomatic. Most of what you learned came from making mistakes and hoping they weren't fatal. First week on the job, you'd probably arrest someone for being drunk in public, only to discover that public drunkenness was basically the town's primary form of entertainment, and you'd just locked up the mayor's brother-in-law. Second week, you'd learn that the dangerous outlaw everyone warns you about was actually a cattle farmer with poor social skills and a tendency to mumble. The really important lessons came through experience that aged you rapidly. Like learning that when someone challenges you to a gunfight, they've probably been practicing, while your shooting experience consists of hunting rabbits and that one time you accidentally shot a chicken. Or discovering that keeping the peace often meant knowing when to ignore obvious crimes because addressing them would cause more problems than they solved. You learn to read people's faces, their body language, the way they move their hands. Was that cowboy reaching for his gun or just scratching an itch? Was that merchant actually being robbed, or was this a domestic dispute masquerading as a crime? These were life or death judgment calls made by men who often had no more qualification for the job than anyone else in town. The education never stopped. Every day brought new challenges that weren't covered in any manual, mainly because no manual existed. How do you handle a dispute between a prostitute and a preacher over property rights? What's the appropriate response when the town's only doctor is also the biggest drunk? How do you maintain law and order when the people writing the laws are 500 miles away and have never seen your town? You learned by surviving, by making friends with the right people, and by developing an almost supernatural ability to tell when someone was about to do something stupid. The sheriffs who lasted weren't necessarily the fastest guns or the smartest men. They were the ones who learned fastest and adapted to a job that changed every day. Let's shift gears into something that movies rarely show: the absolutely bizarre day-to-day crimes that made frontier law enforcement feel like managing a very violent circus. Forget dramatic bank robberies and train heists. Most of your time was spent dealing with crimes so ridiculous that modern police officers would assume someone was pranking them. Take livestock theft, but not the dramatic cattle rustling you're thinking of. No, you'd get called out because someone stole Mrs. Patterson's prize rooster, and she was convinced it was a conspiracy involving her neighbor, the Methodist Church, and possibly the territorial government. The evidence was a trail of feathers that led to 6 different properties, and the witnesses were all chickens who weren't talking. Or consider the Great Outhouse Wars of 1887. Yes, that was a real thing in more than one frontier town. Someone would move their neighbor's outhouse 6 inches to the left, claiming property line disputes. The neighbor would retaliate by filling the original location with rocks. This would escalate until half the town was involved in a feud over toilet placement that required official mediation from a man whose legal training consisted of owning a badge. Then there were the pig crimes. Pigs wandering into saloons and refusing to leave. Pigs getting drunk on fermented fruit and terrorizing Main Street. Pigs somehow learning to open gates and organizing what could only be described as porcine prison breaks. You'd spend entire afternoons chasing intoxicated livestock while trying to maintain the dignity of your office. The gambling disputes were legendarily stupid. Men would bet on anything. Which raindrop would reach the bottom of a window first, how many times the church bell would ring, whether the next person through the door would be wearing boots or shoes. Then they'd get into knife fights over whether that raindrop actually won or just got absorbed by another raindrop, thus disqualifying it from the race. Public indecency cases that defied explanation, like the man who decided that clothing was a government conspiracy and attempted to conduct all his business in the nude, or the woman who became convinced that wearing anything blue would attract lightning and insisted on a police escort every time she needed to buy fabric. And don't get started on the property disputes. Someone would claim ownership of a tree because they'd been sitting under it every Tuesday for 6 months. Another person would insist they owned all the rainwater that fell on their roof and file complaints when neighbors collected water during storms. You'd find yourself officially mediating disputes over who had the right to look at the sunset from their front porch. The alcohol-related crimes went far beyond simple drunkenness. There was competitive drinking that turned into endurance contests lasting days. Moonshine so strong it was technically a chemical weapon. Disputes over who made the best whiskey that required official taste testing by a sheriff who usually wasn't qualified to judge anything stronger than coffee. These weren't the glamorous crimes of legend. They were the daily reality of a job that required you to be part peace officer, part judge, part mediator, and part referee in disputes that would make philosophers question the nature of human civilization. Now let's talk about something that would give modern HR departments nightmares: the hiring practices for frontier law enforcement. The job interview process for becoming a sheriff was flexible, by which I mean it often consisted of someone asking, "Are you breathing?" And if you answered yes, congratulations, you might just be the new face of law and order. The qualifications were refreshingly straightforward. Could you ride a horse without falling off immediately? Bonus points. Could you hold a gun without shooting yourself? You were already ahead of several previous candidates. Did you have both eyes and most of your fingers? The town council was practically ready to throw you a parade. But the real interview happened in public, usually at the local saloon, where the town's leading citizens, and by leading, I mean loudest, would size you up. They'd watch how you handled your liquor, how you reacted to insults, and whether you seemed likely to run away at the first sign of trouble. It was like a very informal psychological evaluation conducted by people who thought psychology was something you caught from bad water. Sometimes the hiring process was even more direct. The previous sheriff would get shot, quit, or decide that gold prospecting was safer than law enforcement, leaving the town without official protection. At which point, someone would stand up in the saloon and ask, "Who wants to be sheriff?" The first person drunk enough to raise their hand often got the job. Other times, it was a matter of elimination. They'd go through a list of candidates, ruling out anyone who was obviously insane, already wanted by the law, or related to too many people who might cause problems. What remained was often a short list of men who were either desperate enough to take the job or stupid enough to think it sounded fun. The pay negotiation was usually brief. "We'll give you $50 a month and a place to sleep." "What about bullets for my gun?" "You'll have to buy your own bullets." "What if I get shot?" "We'll try to find a new sheriff before you start to smell." Benefits package? You got a badge, which might be made of real metal if the town was prosperous, or carved from wood if times were tight. You got the use of the jail, which might have walls that actually kept people inside. And you got the respect of the community, which lasted right up until you had to arrest someone popular or failed to stop a crime that everyone agreed you should have somehow prevented. The background check consisted of asking around to see if anyone knew anything particularly damning about you. Had you killed anyone? If so, did they deserve it? Were you currently wanted for any major crimes? Had you ever successfully held a job for more than a month? These were considered the important questions. Training period? What training period? You got the badge, the keys to the jail, and maybe a brief tour of the town's trouble spots. That's the saloon where the fights happen. That's the alley where people get robbed. That's the house where old Pete goes when he's been drinking, and you don't want to go in there unless you absolutely have to. And then you were on your own, responsible for law and order in a place where both concepts were more theoretical than practical, armed with whatever experience you'd managed to accumulate in your previous life and the desperate hope that most problems would solve themselves before you had to get involved. Let's venture into the truly surreal world of frontier justice, the legal system that made Kafka look like a model of clarity and efficiency. Court was often held wherever they could find space, the saloon after hours, the general store, or sometimes just under a tree if the weather was nice. The judge might be a traveling circuit judge who showed up once a month, the town's most educated citizen, or whoever owned the biggest law book. Jury selection was an adventure in itself. You needed 12 citizens, which in a town of 50 people meant you were scraping the bottom of the barrel. The jury might include the defendant's cousin, someone who owed him money, the person he'd gotten into a fight with last week, and at least 3 people who weren't entirely sure what they were supposed to be doing there. The evidence presentation would make modern attorneys weep. Your Honor, I submit this bottle as evidence that the defendant was drunk. How do we know this bottle belonged to the defendant? Well, he was holding it when we arrested him. Was there any alcohol in it? Not by the time we got it to the courthouse. Witness testimony was equally problematic. Half the witnesses were drunk during the alleged crime. A quarter weren't paying attention, and the rest had their own agendas. Did you see the defendant steal that horse? Well, I saw him riding a horse. Was it his horse? I don't know whose horse it was. Then how do you know he stole it? He looked like the kind of man who would steal a horse. The legal precedents were often made up on the spot. The judge would stroke his beard, look thoughtful, and declare something like, "Well, in my experience, horse thieves usually hang. But since this was technically a mule, I think 30 days in jail seems appropriate." Legal scholars would have been horrified, but it was practical justice in a place where practical was often the best you could hope for. Sentencing was creative to say the least. Fines for people who had no money. Jail time in a jail that might not actually lock. Community service that usually involved cleaning up whatever mess the defendant had made in the first place. And occasionally, punishments that were clearly made up on the spot. You're sentenced to buy drinks for everyone you insulted, apologize to Mrs. Henderson's chickens, and stay out of the saloon on Sundays. Appeals court? What appeals court? If you didn't like the verdict, your options were to accept it, leave town, or hope the judge forgot about it by next week. Justice was swift, if not always accurate, and finality came from practical necessity rather than legal principle. The whole system ran on a combination of common sense, community consensus, and the understanding that perfect justice was less important than keeping the peace. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't always fair, but it was what they had in a place where the nearest real court might be hundreds of miles away. Now, let's explore one of the most dangerous aspects of being a sheriff, the politics. Yes, even in the Wild West, politics could be more deadly than gunfights. And navigating the complex web of town relationships required skills that would make a diplomat proud and the therapist rich. Every town had its power structure, usually invisible to outsiders, but absolutely critical to understand if you wanted to survive as sheriff. There was the official power, the mayor, the town council, the territorial representatives. Then there was the real power, the biggest landowner, the saloon owner who knew everyone's secrets, the madam who controlled information flow, and the preacher who could turn public opinion with a single sermon. Your job as sheriff was to somehow serve all these masters while pretending you only served justice. When the banker's son got drunk and shot up the general store, you had to balance actual law enforcement with the reality that the banker controlled your salary. When the cattle baron's men got into fights with local farmers, you needed to keep peace without alienating either group because you needed both groups to respect your authority. The political calculations were constant and exhausting. Arrest the mayor's brother-in-law for public drunkenness, and suddenly your budget request gets denied. Look the other way when the saloon owner sells liquor to minors and the preacher starts a campaign to have you removed. Try to stay neutral in a property dispute, and both sides decide you're corrupt and incompetent. Election time was particularly treacherous. Yes, many sheriff positions were elected, which meant you had to campaign while doing the job. You'd be trying to solve crimes while also giving speeches about your vision for law enforcement. You'd be mediating disputes between the same people whose votes you needed to keep your job. Your opponents in sheriff elections often used your own cases against you. He let the Morrison boys off easy when they stole those chickens, or he was too harsh on poor old Pete for that little stabbing incident. Every decision you made as sheriff became campaign material for whoever wanted your job. The corruption was usually small-scale and almost quaint by modern standards. Nobody was getting rich off sheriff corruption. There wasn't enough money in these towns for major graft. Instead, it was more like selective enforcement based on who bought you drinks, who invited you to Sunday dinner, or who happened to be related to your deputy. Sometimes the politics got truly bizarre. Towns would split into factions over issues that seemed trivial but carried enormous symbolic weight. Should the jail be painted blue or green? Should arrests be made on Sundays? Was it appropriate to fine people for cursing in front of the church? These debates could determine elections and shape your entire tenure as sheriff. The political pressure came from every direction. The temp race movement wanted you to crack down on drinking, which was like asking you to arrest half the town. The business owners wanted you to maintain order without interfering with commerce, which meant ignoring most gambling and prostitution. The religious community wanted moral enforcement, while the practical community wanted you to focus on actual violence and theft. Navigating this required political skills that most sheriffs had never developed. You learned to give answers that sounded definitive while committing to nothing. You mastered the art of enforcement that looked tough while avoiding actual consequences for influential people. You became a diplomat in a badge, trying to maintain the illusion of impartial justice in a system where partiality was built into every decision. Let's delve into something that Hollywood romanticizes but was actually a nightmare of logistics and terror: pursuing outlaws across the frontier. When criminals fled town, you couldn't just call the next county and ask them to keep an eye out. You had to saddle up and chase them yourself, often across hundreds of miles of dangerous territory with no backup, no communication, and no guarantee you'd ever find your way home. The pursuit usually started with you discovering that your prisoner had escaped, your suspect had fled, or someone had committed a crime serious enough that you couldn't just hope they'd learned their lesson and wouldn't do it again. Horse theft, murder, bank robbery, these were crimes that required you to actually leave town and hunt people down, whether you wanted to or not. Your preparation was whatever you could grab quickly: extra ammunition if you had it, food for a few days if you remember to pack it, a bedroll because you'd probably be sleeping under the stars, and a hope that your horse was in better shape than whatever the criminal was riding, because frontier pursuits often came down to whose mount could last longer. The tracking was part science, part luck, and part educated guessing. You'd follow horse tracks when the ground was soft, ask questions at every settlement you passed, and try to think like someone who was desperate, probably armed, and definitely didn't want to be caught. Did they head for the mountains where they could hide, or toward the railroad where they could disappear? Were they stupid enough to stop at saloons or smart enough to avoid civilization entirely? Days would pass without seeing another human being. You'd be alone with your thoughts, your horse, and the growing realization that you might be chasing someone who was a better outdoorsman than you were. The criminal had a head start, local knowledge, and nothing to lose. You had a badge and a sense of duty, which weren't particularly helpful when you were lost in a canyon with no food and a horse that was starting to give you accusatory looks. When you finally caught up with your quarry, if you caught up, the confrontation was rarely cinematic. More often, you'd find them holed up in some remote cabin, or camped by a stream, or sleeping off a drunk in a settlement 50 miles from nowhere. The arrest could be anticlimactic. You're under arrest. I figured you'd catch up eventually. Or it could turn into a gunfight in terrain that made cover scarce and accuracy problematic. But catching them was only half the problem. Now you had to get them back to town for trial, assuming they didn't escape, die from their wounds, or convince you that they were actually innocent and you should probably be chasing someone else entirely. The trip back was often more dangerous than the pursuit, because now you had a prisoner who knew the territory, had time to think, and might have friends waiting along the trail. Sometimes you'd spend weeks on a pursuit, only to discover that your dangerous criminal was actually a case of mistaken identity, or that the crime you were investigating had been solved while you were gone, or that the town had hired a new sheriff because they assumed you were dead. The isolation was perhaps the worst part. You'd be days from help, carrying responsibility for justice in a situation where justice might get you killed. Chasing people across a landscape that was actively trying to kill you even without human interference. It was law enforcement reduced to its most basic elements. One person with a badge trying to bring consequences to another person who preferred to avoid them. Now let's examine the social dynamics that made being a sheriff feel like managing a very armed soap opera. Frontier towns were small, isolated communities where everyone knew everyone else's business, secrets, and embarrassing relatives. Your job was to maintain law and order among people who had complex relationships spanning years, debts both financial and personal, and grudges that could trace back to disputes over livestock that died before you even arrived in town. The romantic entanglements alone could fill a library of police reports. Saloon girls who fell in love with married farmers, creating jealousy triangles that inevitably ended in violence. Mail-order brides who arrived to discover their intended husbands had grossly misrepresented themselves, leading to breach of contract disputes that somehow became your problem. Lonely ranchers courting the same widow, turning neighborly competition into feuds that required official mediation. Then there were the family dynamics that made modern dysfunction look quaint. Brothers who couldn't agree on inheritance and settled disputes with firearms. Fathers and sons who had philosophical differences about cattle management that escalated into property destruction and assault charges. Mothers-in-law who considered their daughters' marriages to be personal insults requiring revenge. The business relationships were equally complex. Debts between friends that turned friendly disagreements into knife fights. Business partnerships that dissolved when one partner decided the other was cheating, usually based on evidence that wouldn't hold up in any reasonable court. Competition between merchants that involved sabotage, theft, and occasional arson, all conducted by people who sat next to each other in church on Sundays. Your role as sheriff meant you were constantly mediating between people who had to continue living and working together after you resolved their disputes. You couldn't just arrest someone and forget about them. They were part of the community fabric, connected to half a dozen other people who might take their side or hold grudges about how you handled the situation. The information network in these towns was remarkably efficient and completely unreliable. Everyone knew everything about everyone else, but the details changed depending on who was telling the story and what their relationship was to the people involved. You'd investigate a crime only to discover that 3 different witnesses had 3 different versions of events, all delivered with complete confidence and supporting evidence that contradicted each other. Personal loyalty often trumped legal obligation. People would lie to protect friends, tell the truth to hurt enemies, and change their stories based on who was asking and what they hoped to gain. You learned to navigate testimony that was filtered through years of personal relationships, business dealings, and social obligations that had nothing to do with the actual crime you were investigating. The social pressure was constant. Everyone expected you to understand the unwritten rules of community relationships, to know which conflicts were serious and which were just for show, to recognize when someone was asking for help and when they were just trying to get someone they disliked in trouble. Managing this required social skills that weren't taught in any manual, mainly because no manual existed for maintaining law and order in a place where order was negotiated daily among people who all knew each other's weaknesses and were armed. Let's pivot to something that would make modern law enforcement officers grateful for their training: handling medical emergencies with absolutely no medical knowledge, equipment, or backup. As sheriff, you were often the closest thing to emergency services in situations where emergency could mean anything from gunshot wounds to snake bites to women giving birth in the middle of Main Street during a thunderstorm. The medical training for frontier sheriffs was essentially try not to make things worse, which was surprisingly difficult when you had no idea what worse looked like in any given situation. Someone gets shot in a gunfight, and suddenly you're expected to know whether they're dying, faking it, or just dramatic about pain. Someone collapses in the street, and you have to decide if it's a heart attack, too much whiskey, or an elaborate attempt to distract you while their partner robs the bank. Your medical supplies consisted of whatever you could scrounge up on short notice. Clean cloth for bandages, assuming you could find clean cloth in a town where laundry was more of a suggestion than a practice. Whiskey for sterilization and pain relief, which was convenient because whiskey was usually the most abundant resource available. And prayer, which was free and arguably as effective as anything else you had access to. Gunshot wounds were unfortunately common and completely outside your expertise. You'd find yourself trying to determine if a bullet had hit anything vital while the victim either screamed advice, cursed your incompetence, or helpfully passed out so you could panic in relative peace. The standard treatment was basically stop the bleeding, pour whiskey on everything, and hope the nearest doctor is closer than the nearest undertaker. Broken bones were another adventure in improvised medicine. You'd be splinting arms with whatever wood you could find, using rope or torn cloth for binding, and trying to remember if you were supposed to move the injured limb or leave it alone. Half the time, you'd discover that what looked like a broken bone was actually just a very dramatic bruise. And the other half, you'd realize that what looked like a minor injury actually required amputation. Childbirth was perhaps the most terrifying medical emergency you could face as sheriff. Women would go into labor at the most inconvenient times and places, and somehow it became your responsibility to either help deliver the baby or find someone who knew what they were doing. Your qualifications for this were basically, you're an authority figure and you're here, which weren't particularly useful when faced with actual medical complications. Poisoning cases, usually from bad water, spoiled food, or homemade alcohol that was more paint thinner than beverage, required detective skills you didn't have and medical knowledge that didn't exist. You'd be trying to figure out what someone ingested while also trying to treat symptoms that could indicate anything from mild indigestion to imminent death. Snake bites, spider bites, and encounters with wildlife that left people injured or traumatized fell under your jurisdiction by default. You'd be dealing with wounds from animals you couldn't identify, using treatments that were mostly folklore, hoping that whatever you did would help rather than accelerate the dying process. The psychological pressure was enormous. People looked to you as an authority figure who should know how to handle medical emergencies, when in reality, you were just as confused and terrified as they were. You had to project confidence while privately hoping that someone more qualified would show up before you accidentally made the situation worse. Sometimes you got lucky, and the injured person recovered despite your help. Sometimes they died, despite your best efforts. And sometimes you'd discover that your emergency medical intervention had been completely unnecessary because the victim was either faking it for attention or had recovered on their own while you were running around town looking for supplies. The experience taught you to recognize the difference between serious injuries and dramatic performances, though the learning curve involved making mistakes that you'd remember for the rest of your career. It also taught you that frontier medicine was equal parts skill, luck, and the patient's determination to survive despite the treatment they received. In the end, being a Wild West sheriff wasn't about heroics or legendary gunfights. It was about showing up every day in a place where civilization was still just an idea, armed with inadequate training, impossible responsibilities, and the stubborn belief that someone had to be responsible for keeping the peace. You dealt with crimes that ranged from serious to ridiculous, people who were complex and contradictory, and situations that required you to be part lawman, part diplomat, part medic, and part referee in disputes that often made no sense to anyone who hadn't lived in that specific community for years. The sheriffs who survived learned to adapt, to read people and situations, to know when to enforce the law strictly and when to look the other way for the greater good. They developed skills that weren't taught in any academy because no academy existed. They made decisions that affected entire communities based on experience they gained by surviving their mistakes. Some became legends, remembered for dramatic confrontations and heroic stands against overwhelming odds. But most were ordinary men who took an extraordinary job in an impossible situation and somehow made it work, well enough that people could live their lives without constant fear of violence and chaos. The Wild West Sheriff was a uniquely American invention, part public servant, part entrepreneur, part survivor, trying to bring order to a place where order was negotiated daily among people who were all armed, often drunk, and definitely not interested in having their behavior regulated by someone who might not even be from their state. For a brief, violent, and utterly fascinating period in American history, these men stood between order and chaos with nothing more than a badge, a gun, and the desperate hope that civilization would eventually catch up to the frontier. The Battle of the Little Bighorn. The summer of 1876 blazed across the northern plains of Montana Territory with an intensity that seemed to mirror the tensions simmering beneath the surface of the American frontier. The Black Hills of South Dakota, sacred to the Lakota Sioux as Pahasapa, had become a powder keg waiting to explode. Gold had been discovered in those hills, the yellow metal that drove white men to madness and made them forget every treaty they had ever signed. For the Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples, the Black Hills represented far more than land. They were the heart of the world, the place where warriors went to seek visions, where the spirits of their ancestors dwelled among the pines and granite peaks. The Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868 had promised that this land would remain theirs forever, as long as grass grew and water flowed. But forever, it seemed, lasted only as long as white men believed there was nothing of value beneath the sacred soil. The discovery of gold changed everything. Prospectors flooded into the Black Hills despite the treaty, protected by the very government that had promised to keep them out. The situation was untenable, and by 1876, the federal government had issued an ultimatum. All Native Americans must report to their designated reservations by January 31, 1876, or be considered hostile and subject to military action. Many refused. Led by chiefs like Sitting Bull of the Hunkpapa Lakota and Crazy Horse of the Oglala Lakota, thousands of Native Americans gathered in the valleys of the Powder River, the Rosebud, and the Little Bighorn. They came not as raiders or aggressors, but as free people, determined to live according to their traditions on land that had been theirs since time immemorial. Tatanka Iotanka, known to whites as Sitting Bull, was not a war chief in the traditional sense, but a holy man whose visions and spiritual leadership had made him one of the most influential figures among the Plains tribes. Born around 1831, he had witnessed the steady encroachment of white settlers and the broken promises of countless treaties. By 1876, at 45 years old, Sitting Bull had become the spiritual and political center around which the resistance coalesced. Just weeks before the battle that would make him famous, Sitting Bull had participated in the Sundance ceremony, offering 50 pieces of flesh from his arms as sacrifice. During this ritual, he experienced a powerful vision: soldiers falling into the Indian camp like grasshoppers falling from the sky, their heads pointing toward the earth, a sign that they would die. This vision would prove prophetic, strengthening the resolve of warriors who already saw Sitting Bull as chosen by the Great Spirit to lead them in their darkest hour. If Sitting Bull was the spiritual heart of the resistance, Tashunka Uitiko, or Crazy Horse, was its sword. Born around 1840, he was a legendary warrior of the Ogallala Lakota, known for his tactical brilliance and absolute fearlessness in battle. Crazy Horse had never signed a treaty with the white man, never set foot on a reservation, and never allowed himself to be photographed. He embodied the spirit of the free Plains Indian in a way that both inspired his people and terrified his enemies. Crazy Horse's reputation had been forged in countless battles, but perhaps none more significant than his victory over Captain William Fetterman in 1866, when he led a decoy party that lured 81 soldiers to their deaths near Fort Phil Kearny. His tactical genius lay in his ability to coordinate complex maneuvers while maintaining the fierce independence that characterized Plains Indian warfare. On the other side of this gathering storm stood Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer of the 7th Cavalry Regiment. Born in Ohio in 1839, Custer had earned fame during the Civil War as the youngest general in the Union Army, a flamboyant officer known for his flowing golden hair, his love of glory, and his seemingly charmed life on the battlefield. After the war, like many career officers, he had been reduced in rank and assigned to frontier duty, where his aggressive tactics and controversial methods had made him both famous and infamous. Custer was a man of contradictions. He was genuinely brave, even recklessly so, but also vain and ambitious to the point of endangering his men. He had graduated last in his class from West Point, yet possessed an intuitive understanding of cavalry tactics. He loved his wife Elizabeth with touching devotion, writing her tender letters from the field, yet showed little compassion for the Indian families destroyed by his campaigns. Most importantly for the events that would unfold at the Little Bighorn, Custer believed absolutely in his own destiny and his ability to triumph over any obstacle through sheer audacity and will. The stage was set for confrontation by the spring of 1876, when the U.S. Army launched a three-pronged campaign designed to force the hostile Indians back to their reservations. General Alfred Terry would march west from Fort Abraham Lincoln in Dakota Territory with Custer's 7th Cavalry. Colonel John Gibbon would move east from Fort Ellis in Montana Territory. General George Crook would advance north from Fort Fetterman in Wyoming Territory. The plan was to catch the Indians in a pincer movement, preventing their escape and forcing a decisive battle. But the Plains Indians had their own plans. Throughout the spring and early summer of 1876, tribal bands converged in unprecedented numbers in the valleys of southeastern Montana. The gathering was unlike anything seen before on the Great Plains. Estimates vary, but historians believe that between 10,000 and 15,000 Native Americans had assembled, with perhaps 3,000 to 4,000 of them warriors. This was not just a war party, but an entire civilization on the move. Men, women, children, elders, horses, and dogs, all following the buffalo herds and living in the traditional way that the U.S. government was determined to end forever. The first major engagement of the campaign came on June 17, 1876, when Crazy Horse led a large force of warriors against General Crook's column at the Battle of the Rosebud. In a fierce 6-hour fight, Crazy Horse's tactical brilliance was on full display. Rather than employing the traditional Plains Indian tactics of individual combat and quick raids, he coordinated his warriors in sustained assaults that repeatedly broke Crook's formations. The battle was technically a draw, but it achieved the Indians' strategic objective. Crook's force was so badly mauled that it withdrew from the campaign, eliminating one prong of the army's three-part offensive. Unknown to the other columns, Crook's withdrawal had fundamentally altered the strategic situation. Terry and Gibbon were now operating with the assumption that Crook was still advancing from the south, potentially driving the Indians toward them. In reality, they were alone, facing a Native American force that was both larger than expected and emboldened by recent victory. On June 21, 1876, the steamer Far West carried General Terry, Colonel Gibbon, and Lieutenant Colonel Custer up the Yellowstone River to the mouth of the Rosebud Creek for a crucial strategy conference. The three officers spread their maps on a table in the steamer's cabin, the oil lamps casting flickering shadows as they planned what they believed would be the final campaign against the Sioux and their allies. Terry's plan was based on the best intelligence available, but intelligence that would prove fatally flawed. Scouts had reported a large Indian trail leading from the Rosebud Creek toward the Little Bighorn River. Terry believed that the Indians were moving toward the Bighorn Mountains, trying to escape the closing net of army columns. His strategy was to have Gibbon's column march up the Yellowstone and Bighorn rivers to block the Indians' escape route to the north, while Custer's 7th Cavalry would follow the Indian trail up the Rosebud and then strike the village from the south, driving the Indians into Gibbon's waiting forces. The plan had a fatal assumption built into it, that the Indians were fleeing. In reality, the massive gathering of tribes had no intention of running. They were at the height of their power, confident in their numbers and their recent victory over Crook. Rather than a collection of frightened refugees trying to escape, Terry was sending Custer against what was arguably the largest and most powerful Native American military force ever assembled on the Great Plains.
Custer received his orders on the evening of June 21. Terry's written instructions were tactful but clear. Custer was to follow the Indian trail discovered by Major Marcus Reno's reconnaissance. If the trail led toward the Little Bighorn, Custer was not to follow it directly, but to continue south and approach the valley from the south and east, ensuring that the Indians could not escape in that direction. Terry and Gibbon would be approaching from the north, and the two columns would coordinate their attack for June 26. But Terry also gave Custer considerable discretion, acknowledging that it is impossible to give you any definite instructions in regard to this movement, and, were it not impossible to do so, the department commander places too much confidence in your zeal, energy, and ability to wish to impose upon you precise orders which might hamper your action when nearly in contact with the enemy. This discretion would prove crucial because Custer had no intention of sharing glory with Terry and Gibbon. He was acutely aware that 1876 was a presidential election year and that a spectacular victory over the Sioux could propel him into national politics. Custer had political ambitions that extended far beyond the frontier army, and he saw the Little Bighorn campaign as his opportunity to achieve the kind of fame that could open doors in Washington. At noon on June 22, 1876, the 7th Cavalry Regiment rode out from the mouth of the Rosebud Creek, 647 officers and men strong, accompanied by a small group of Arikara and Crow scouts who had their own ancient grievances against the Sioux. Custer had divided his regiment into 12 companies, each designated by a letter of the alphabet. The regimental band played Gary Owen, Custer's favorite marching tune, as the column disappeared into the Badlands of southeastern Montana. The march up the Rosebud was grueling. The June heat was oppressive, with temperatures reaching over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The landscape was a maze of coulees, ridges, and dry creek beds that forced the column to constantly change direction. Dust clouds rose from the horses' hooves, coating men and animals alike in a fine, choking powder that got into eyes, noses, and throats. Water was scarce, and what they found was often alkaline and barely drinkable. But it was the Indian Trail that truly captured everyone's attention. Major Reno's scouts had not exaggerated its size. The trail was so wide and well-worn that it looked like a highway through the wilderness.
Cavalry horses accustomed to single-file trails could march 4 abreast and still not cover its width. The trail was marked by the parallel grooves of thousands of travois, the poles dragged behind horses to carry the belongings of entire families. Lodgepole marks, pony tracks, and the remains of countless campfires told the story of a migration unlike anything the soldiers had ever seen. As they followed the trail, Custer's scouts brought him increasingly alarming intelligence. Half-breed interpreter Mitch Booyer, one of the most experienced frontiersmen in the territory, repeatedly warned Custer that the signs indicated an Indian force far larger than anyone had anticipated. The Crow Scouts, traditional enemies of the Sioux, were becoming visibly nervous as the trail grew fresher and the signs more ominous. On the evening of June 24th, the regiment made camp near the divide between the Rosebud and Little Bighorn valleys. Custer called his officers together for a conference that would be remembered by survivors as unusually somber. Captain Frederick Benton, a veteran officer who had little love for his flamboyant commander, later recalled that Custer seemed uncharacteristically subdued, perhaps finally grasping the magnitude of what they were approaching. But if Custer had doubts, he kept them for himself. That night, he made the decision that would seal the fate of his command. Rather than waiting for Terry and Gibbon as originally planned, he would attack the Indian village at dawn on June 25. His reasoning was partly tactical. He feared that the Indians might scatter if given more time, but it was also deeply personal. Custer wanted the glory for himself and his regiment, not shared with other commanders. At 11:30 p.m. on June 24, Custer roused his sleeping regiment. In the darkness, the 7th Cavalry began what would be its final march. The men moved quietly, speaking in whispers, equipment muffled to avoid detection. Many of the soldiers were recent immigrants who barely spoke English, men who had joined the army for steady pay and 3 meals a day. They knew they were approaching a large Indian village, but few understood the true scope of what awaited them in the valley of the Little Bighorn. As dawn broke on June 25, 1876, Custer and his Crow Scouts climbed to a high ridge known to the Indians as the Crow's Nest. From this vantage point, they could see across the divide into the Little Bighorn Valley. What they saw should have given even Custer pause. In the early morning light, the scouts could make out an enormous village stretching for miles along the winding river. Smoke from countless cooking fires rose into the still air. And even at a distance of 15 miles, they could see the vast pony herds grazing on the valley's rich grass. White Man Runs Him, one of the Crow Scouts, tried to explain to Custer what they were seeing. Using sign language and broken English, he attempted to convey that this was not just a large village, but the largest gathering of Plains Indians anyone had ever seen. The scout tried to count the lodges by making marks in the dirt, but gave up when he reached several hundred, simply making a sweeping gesture that encompassed the entire valley. But Custer's white scouts were less certain. The distance was great, and the morning haze made details difficult to discern. Some reported seeing the village. Others claimed they saw only scattered horses and perhaps a few lodges. What everyone agreed on was that there were Indians in the valley. The question was how many? At this crucial moment, Custer made a decision that revealed both his greatest strength and his fatal weakness as a commander. Rather than taking time for careful reconnaissance, rather than waiting for Terry and Gibbon as planned, rather than heeding the warnings of his most experienced scouts, Custer decided to attack immediately. His reasoning was characteristic. Audacity had never failed him before, and he believed that speed and surprise could overcome any disadvantage in numbers. At approximately 12:15 p.m. on June 25, 1876, Custer divided his regiment into 4 battalions. Major Marcus Reno would take companies A, G, and M, about 140 men, and attack the southern end of the village. Captain Frederick Benteen would take companies D, H, and K, about 125 men, and sweep to the south to ensure that no Indians escaped in that direction. Captain Thomas McDougall would guard the pack train with Company B, about 130 men including civilians and packers. Custer himself would take companies C, E, F, I, and L, about 210 men, and move north along the bluffs east of the river, looking for an opportunity to strike the village from an unexpected direction. The plan was vintage Custer, aggressive, complex, and based on the assumption that speed and surprise could compensate for being outnumbered. Each battalion would operate independently, without any means of communication once the battle began. It was a plan that might have worked against a smaller, less organized force. Against the massive village waiting in the Little Bighorn Valley, it was a recipe for disaster. As the four columns separated, riding toward their various assignments, many of the soldiers had a sense that something momentous was about to happen. Trumpeter John Martin, an Italian immigrant whose real name was Giovanni Martini, later recalled the strange quiet that seemed to settle over the landscape, broken only by the sound of horses' hooves on the dry earth and the creaking of saddle leather. In the Indian village below, the day had begun like any other. Children played in the shallows of the Little Bighorn River, while their mothers gathered water and tended to the morning's tasks. Warriors lounged in the shade of their lodges, some still nursing wounds from the fight with Crook at the Rosebud 8 days earlier. The vast pony herds grazed peacefully on the rich grass of the valley floor. The village was laid out in the traditional manner, with each tribal group maintaining its own section. The Hunkpapa Lakota, led by Sitting Bull, held the southern end. Moving north along the river were the camps of the Blackfeet Lakota, Sans Arc Lakota, Minneconjou Lakota, Oglala Lakota, and Northern Cheyenne. It was a city of hide lodges stretching for nearly 3 miles along the river, home to perhaps 12,000 to 15,000 people. But this was no ordinary village. The gathering represented the largest concentration of Plains Indian military power in history. Among the lodges moved warriors whose names would become legend: Crazy Horse of the Oglala, Two Moon of the Cheyenne, Lame Deer of the Minneconjou, and hundreds of others whose skills had been honed in countless battles against enemy tribes and U.S. forces. These were not reservation Indians dependent on government rations, but free warriors at the height of their power, well armed with repeating rifles obtained through trade and previous battles. At approximately 3 p.m., the tranquility of the afternoon was shattered by the sound of gunfire from the southern end of the village. Major Reno's battalion had splashed across the Little Bighorn River and was charging toward the Hunkpapa camp, carbines blazing and sabers drawn. For a few moments, it seemed as though the surprise attack might succeed. Women and children scattered, and some warriors ran for their horses. But the advantage of surprise lasted only minutes. The Hunkpapa warriors, led by chiefs like Gall and Black Moon, quickly organized their defense. Rather than fleeing in panic, they began to pour rifle fire into Reno's exposed force. The major quickly realized that he was facing far more opposition than expected and ordered his men to dismount and form a skirmish line at the edge of the timber along the river. What followed was a fierce firefight that lasted nearly an hour. Reno's 140 troopers found themselves facing hundreds of warriors who seemed to appear from every direction. The Indians' tactics were fluid and deadly effective. Rather than massing for frontal assaults, they used the terrain masterfully, taking cover behind trees, rocks, and ridges while pouring accurate rifle fire into the soldiers' positions. As the battle intensified, more and more warriors arrived from other parts of the village. The sound of gunfire had alerted the entire camp, and mounted warriors were streaming toward the fight from every direction. Reno, seeing his position becoming increasingly untenable, made the fateful decision to withdraw across the river. What should have been an orderly retreat quickly became a rout. As the soldiers broke from their positions and ran for their horses, the Indians pressed their attack. In the confusion, many troopers became separated from their mounts. Others found their horses dead or wounded. The retreat across the river became a desperate race for survival, with warriors pursuing the fleeing soldiers and picking off stragglers. Reno's battalion finally found refuge on a high bluff on the east side of the river, where they were soon joined by Benteen's command, which had heard the firing and abandoned its sweep to the south. The combined force of about 350 men dug in on what would become known as Reno Hill, where they would endure a siege that lasted until the next day. But as Reno's men were fighting for their lives at the southern end of the village, Custer and his 5 companies were moving north along the eastern bluffs, looking for a place to strike the village. From their position on the high ground, Custer's men could see the chaos in the southern part of the camp as Reno's attack developed. They could also see something that must have filled them with both excitement and apprehension: the true size of the Indian village spread out below them. Custer sent several messages back to Benteen, urging him to come quickly and bring ammunition packs. The most famous of these messages, carried by trumpeter Martin, read, "Benteen, come on, big village, be quick, bring packs, W.W. Cook. P.S. Bring packs." The urgency in the message and the misspelling that revealed the haste with which it was written suggested that Custer was beginning to grasp the magnitude of what he faced. But it was too late for second thoughts. As Custer's column moved north along the bluffs, they were spotted by Indian scouts. Word spread quickly through the village that another group of soldiers was approaching from the east. Warriors who had been fighting Reno began to disengage and move north to meet this new threat.
At approximately 4 p.m., Custer made his final, fatal decision. Rather than continuing north to link up with Terry and Gibbon as originally planned, he decided to attack the village immediately. From a high ridge that would later bear his name, Custer could see that the Indians were in apparent confusion, with many fleeing north away from Reno's attack. He believed that a sudden assault from an unexpected direction might scatter the entire village. Custer ordered his 5 companies down from the bluffs toward the river. His plan seems to have been to cross the Little Bighorn at a ford near the northern end of the village and attack the camp from the rear. It was a bold move, typical of Custer's aggressive style, but it would prove to be his last. As the 210 men of Custer's battalion descended toward the river, they rode into a trap that had been developing for hours. The fleeing Indians that Custer had observed were not actually in full retreat. Instead, they were part of a tactical withdrawal designed to draw the soldiers into the open ground along the river where they could be surrounded and destroyed. Crazy Horse, the master tactician who had orchestrated the victory over Crook at the Rosebud, was once again demonstrating his genius for Plains Indian warfare. Rather than meeting Custer's charge head-on, he had positioned his warriors to envelop the soldiers once they committed to the attack. Hidden in the coulees and behind ridges, hundreds of warriors waited for the signal to spring their trap. The Battle of the Little Bighorn entered its final, most famous phase as Custer's men approached the river. What happened next would be debated by historians for generations because there would be no survivors from Custer's battalion to tell the tale. The story of the last stand would have to be pieced together from Indian accounts, archaeological evidence, and the positions of the bodies found 3 days later. The attack began as Custer had planned, with his companies charging toward the ford in column formation. But as they neared the river, they encountered fierce resistance from warriors concealed along the banks. The narrow approach to the ford became a killing ground, with rifle fire pouring down from hidden positions on both sides. Unable to force the crossing, Custer ordered his men to withdraw to higher ground. But as they pulled back, the trap closed around them. Warriors who had been concealed in the ravines and coulees suddenly appeared, cutting off the soldiers' retreat. Other war parties, led by chiefs like Crazy Horse and Gal, swept around the flanks of the battalion, completing the encirclement. What followed was not the dramatic cavalry charge of Hollywood movies, but a confused, desperate fighting retreat as Custer's men tried to reach the high ground of what is now called Last Stand Hill. The soldiers moved in small groups, some mounted, others on foot, fighting a running battle against increasing numbers of warriors who seemed to appear from every direction. The discipline and cohesion of the 7th Cavalry began to break down under the relentless pressure. Companies became separated, officers lost control of their men, and what had begun as an organized military operation devolved into individual struggles for survival. Soldiers found themselves fighting hand-to-hand with warriors who had been honing their combat skills since childhood. The end came with shocking suddenness.
Archaeological evidence suggests that the final phase of the battle lasted perhaps 30 to 45 minutes. As the soldiers were compressed into an ever smaller area on the ridges above the river, their ammunition began to run low. The superior numbers of the warriors, their knowledge of the terrain, and their coordinated tactics proved overwhelming. One by one, the companies of the 7th Cavalry were overrun. Captain Miles Cogg's Company I made a desperate stand on a ridge south of Last Stand Hill, but was annihilated almost to a man. Companies C and E, commanded by Custer's brother Tom and his brother-in-law James Calhoun, were destroyed trying to hold the flanks of the position. Company F, led by Captain George Yates, died with Custer himself on the hill that would bear his name.
The last moments of George Armstrong Custer's life remain shrouded in mystery and controversy. Indian accounts vary, with some saying he fought bravely to the end, others claiming he was one of the first to fall. What seems certain is that he died surrounded by the remnants of his command, his golden hair still flowing despite the carnage around him, his body unmarked by the mutilation that befell many of his soldiers. As the shooting died away and silence returned to the ridges above the Little Bighorn River, the magnitude of what had happened began to sink in. In less than an hour, 5 companies of the 7th Cavalry Regiment had been completely destroyed. 210 men, including Custer himself, his brothers Tom and Boston, his nephew Oddie Reed, and his brother-in-law James Calhoun, lay dead on the Montana prairie. It was the worst defeat suffered by the U.S. Army in the Indian Wars, and it sent shockwaves across the nation. But for the victorious warriors, there was little time for celebration. The experienced chiefs knew that this victory, however complete, would bring terrible retribution. As the sun set on June 25, 1876, the great village began to break up, with different tribal groups scattering in various directions. The unity that had made their victory possible would not survive the aftermath of their triumph. The siege of Reno Hill continued through the night and into the next day, with the combined force of Reno and Benteen's commands fighting desperately to hold their position. The Indians kept up a steady fire from surrounding ridges, and casualties mounted steadily. Several attempts to reach water were beaten back with heavy losses, and the wounded suffered terribly in the June heat. Relief finally came on the afternoon of June 27, when the columns of Terry and Gibbon arrived at the battlefield. The sight that greeted them was one they would never forget. Scattered across the ridges and coulees were the bodies of Custer's entire command, stripped and mutilated according to Indian custom. The scale of the disaster was immediately apparent, and the rescue of Reno's embattled force became the secondary priority. The discovery of Custer's body on Last Stand Hill became one of the most iconic moments in American frontier history. According to the accounts of those who found him, Custer had been shot twice, once in the chest and once in the head, but his body had not been scalped or mutilated. Some said this was out of respect for his courage, others that the Indians did not recognize him. His long flowing hair, the trademark that had made him famous, was intact. The news of Custer's defeat reached the American public during the centennial celebrations of July 4, 1876, creating a sensation that overshadowed even the national birthday. Newspapers across the country ran headlines about the massacre at Little Bighorn, and Custer was instantly transformed from a controversial military figure into a martyred national hero. The defeat fed into existing narratives about savage Indians and heroic cavalry, launching 1,000 dime novels and eventually countless movies that would shape American popular culture for generations. But the Indian victory at Little Bighorn was also their greatest strategic defeat. The death of Custer and his men provided the U.S. government with the justification it needed for an all-out war against the Plains tribes. Public opinion, which had been somewhat divided about the government's Indian policy, solidified behind demands for revenge. Congress appropriated additional funds for military operations, and the Army launched a series of campaigns that would systematically destroy the remaining free bands of Plains Indians.
Within a year of their greatest victory, most of the warriors who had fought at Little Bighorn were dead, captured, or confined to reservations. Crazy Horse surrendered in May 1877 and was killed 4 months later under disputed circumstances at Fort Robinson. Sitting Bull fled to Canada with a small band of followers, but eventually returned to surrender in 1881. The great buffalo herds that had sustained Plains Indian civilization were systematically slaughtered, removing the economic foundation of their way of life. The Battle of the Little Bighorn thus marked both the high points and the beginning of the end of Plains Indian resistance to American expansion. It was the last great victory of the mounted warriors who had dominated the Great Plains for generations, but it was also the catalyst for their final defeat. The tactics that had served them so well against isolated army units proved inadequate against the full weight of American industrial and military power deployed in a war of extermination.
For the American military, Little Bighorn became a painful lesson in the dangers of underestimating an enemy and dividing forces in the face of superior numbers. The tactical errors that led to Custer's defeat would be studied in military academies for generations, but the strategic impact of the battle was ultimately to accelerate the conquest of the West that Custer had died trying to achieve. The battlefield itself became a symbol and a shrine, preserved first as a national cemetery and later as a national monument. The white marble headstones that mark where each soldier fell tell their own story of the battle's final moments, with clusters of markers showing where small groups made their last stands, and individual stones marking where men died alone, far from their comrades. In the end, the Battle of the Little Bighorn was a collision between two cultures, two ways of life, and two different concepts of warfare that could not coexist on the Great Plains. The victory of Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and their warriors was complete and glorious, but it was also the last gasp of a civilization that was already doomed by the relentless advance of American settlement and industrial development. The story of June 25, 1876 continues to fascinate Americans because it represents so many contradictions and complexities of the national experience. It was a battle where the underdogs won decisively, but where victory led inevitably to defeat. It was a clash between military professionals and warriors fighting for their homeland, between industrial organization and individual courage, between two peoples who might have lived in peace but instead chose to settle their differences through violence. The ghosts of Custer, Sitting Bull, and Crazy Horse still haunt the windswept ridges above the Little Bighorn River, reminders of a day when the fate of the American West hung in the balance, and the course of history turned on the courage and decisions of men who knew they were fighting for everything they held dear. In the end, both sides lost more than they gained, but the echoes of their battle continue to resonate through American history and imagination, a testament to the complexity and tragedy of the conquest of the West. The legend of Sheriff Marcus Iron Thornfield. The sun hung like a copper coin in the dust-choked sky above Redemption Creek, casting long shadows across the weathered boardwalks of what folks generously called a town. It was the kind of place where hope came to die and lawlessness came to thrive, where the saloon stayed open 24 hours and the church had been abandoned so long that tumbleweeds had made themselves at home in the pews. Nobody expected much when the tall stranger rode into town that scorching July morning in 1873. His black gelding's hooves clicking against the sun-baked earth with the steady rhythm of a clock counting down to Judgment Day. The man in the saddle sat straight as a rifle barrel, his weathered face shaded by the brim of a hat that had seen better decades. What caught everyone's attention wasn't his imposing 6'3" frame or the twin Colt 45s that rode low on his hips like sleeping serpents. It was the gleaming star pinned to his vest that caught the morning light and threw it back like a challenge. "Name's Marcus Thornfield," he announced to the gathering crowd, his voice carrying the authority of distant thunder. "I'm your new sheriff." The laughter started as a snicker from somewhere near the saloon doors, then spread like wildfire through the assembled onlookers. In a town where the last 3 sheriffs had lasted a combined total of 6 weeks before being run out, shot at, or simply disappearing into the desert, the idea of law and order had become something of a dark joke.
Ezra Blackjack Morrison, the unofficial king of Redemption Creek's criminal elements, pushed through the crowd with the swagger of a man who'd never met a law he couldn't break or a lawman he couldn't intimidate. His gang of cutthroats flanked him like loyal hounds, hands resting casually on gun handles worn smooth by frequent use. "Well, well," Blackjack drawled, his gold tooth catching the light as he grinned. "Another 10-star hero come to tame our little slice of hell. Tell me, Sheriff, how long you figure you'll last? I'm taking bets. Current odds are 3 days, tops." Thornfield dismounted with the fluid grace of a man half his 42 years, never taking his steel-gray eyes off Morrison. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, measured, but it carried across the suddenly silent street like the whisper of wind before a tornado. "Mr. Morrison, I presume? I've heard quite a bit about you on my way here. Cattle rustling, bank robbery, murder? Quite an impressive resume for a man who's managed to avoid a noose this long." Blackjack's grin faltered for just a moment before returning twice as wide and 3 times as menacing. Big words from a man standing alone in a town that doesn't want you. Alone? Thornfield glanced around at the faces watching from doorways and windows, seeing fear where there should have been hope, resignation where there should have been determination. Maybe, but not for long. What happened next became the stuff of legend, though the details varied depending on who was telling the story and how much whiskey had been consumed beforehand. What everyone agreed on was this: Blackjack Morrison, who'd killed 7 men in fair fights and twice that many in unfair ones, went for his gun first. The draw was lightning quick, faster than most eyes could follow, but Thornfield was faster. The report of the Colt 45 echoed off the false fronts of the buildings like a declaration of war. Blackjack stood frozen for a moment, his own weapon only halfway out of its holster, staring down at the neat hole that had appeared in his right shoulder. His gun clattered to the dirt as he stumbled backward, clutching his wounded arm. "Next time, I aim for the heart," Thornfield said calmly, never having shifted his stance. "Goes for any of you boys who think this town isn't big enough for the law." The rest of Morrison's gang seemed suddenly fascinated by their boots, the sky, anything that wasn't the new sheriff's unwavering gaze. One by one, they melted back into the crowd like shadows fleeing the dawn. As Blackjack was helped away, cursing and bleeding, Thornfield holstered his weapon and surveyed his new domain. It wasn't much to look at, a collection of ramshackle buildings strung along a dusty main street like broken teeth in a skull's grin. The jail was little more than a reinforced shack with bars on the windows, the sheriff's office barely large enough for a desk and a chair. But it was his now, and he intended to make something of it.
"Anybody know where I can find a deputy?" he called out to the dispersing crowd. An old-timer with a beard like spun silver spat tobacco juice into the dust and cackled. "Son, you just shot the only man in town brave enough or stupid enough to pin on a badge alongside you." Thornfield smiled for the first time since arriving, and it transformed his stern features into something almost approachable. "Then I guess I'll have to make some more." The first person to answer Thornfield's call for deputies was someone nobody expected: Sarah McKenna, a widow whose husband had been gunned down by Morrison's gang 6 months prior while defending his small general store. She stood barely 5 feet tall in her worn boots, but her green eyes burned with a fire that had nothing to do with the desert heat. "I can shoot straight, ride hard, and I know this territory better than any man in 3 counties, she declared, standing in the doorway of the sheriff's office like a challenge personified. "And I've got more reason than most to see justice done in this town." Thornfield studied her for a long moment, noting the Remington revolver she wore on her hip with the easy familiarity of someone who knew how to use it. In the weeks since his arrival, he'd managed to establish a tenuous peace through a combination of fast draws, strategic arrests, and the kind of psychological warfare that came from being absolutely unpredictable. But he knew it wouldn't last without help. "Mrs. McKenna, this job has a tendency to make widows out of wives and orphans out of children. I won't sugarcoat the dangers."
"My husband's already dead," she replied flatly. "My children are grown and moved east. All I've got left is this town and the need to see it become something better than a haven for murderers and thieves. You offering me the chance to do something about it, or just warning me off?" He pinned the deputy star to her vest himself, and Sarah McKenna became the first woman deputy in the territory's history. The decision scandalized some and outraged others, but Thornfield had learned long ago that survival required innovation, and innovation often meant breaking rules that weren't working anyway. The second deputy was Tommy Fast Hands Rodriguez, a former card-sharpened gunslinger who'd grown tired of the outlaw life after watching too many friends die young and stupid. He was barely 25, but moved with the coiled readiness of a rattlesnake, his dark eyes constantly scanning for threats that experience had taught him were everywhere. "I ain't looking for redemption, Sheriff," Tommy said when he accepted the badge. "I just want to see if being on the right side of the law feels any different than being on the wrong side." "Redemption's not something I can give you, son," Thornfield replied. "But purpose? That's something we can work with." The third deputy was perhaps the most unlikely of all, Reverend Josiah Stone, an ordained minister who'd arrived in Redemption Creek with nothing but a worn Bible and an unshakable faith in the possibility of human redemption. He was a giant of a Negro man, 6.5 feet tall, with hands that could palm a man's head like a melon. But he spoke with the gentle authority of someone who'd seen the worst of humanity and still believed in the best. "Violence is sometimes necessary to protect the innocent," he explained when Thornfield questioned his desire to wear a badge. "The Lord knows I've seen enough of it to understand its place in the grand design. Sometimes you have to fight the devil with fire." With his unlikely trio of deputies, Thornfield began the slow, dangerous work of transforming Redemption Creek from a lawless hellhole into something resembling civilization. They started with the small things, breaking up bar fights before they turned deadly, ensuring the mail got through without being robbed, and making sure the schoolmarm could walk to work without fear of harassment. But they knew the real test would come when Blackjack Morrison decided he'd healed enough to reclaim his territory. The attack came on a moonless night in late August, when the desert air still shimmered with heat even hours after sunset. Morrison had spent the previous month gathering reinforcements from across the territory, gunslingers, rustlers, and killers drawn by the promise of easy money and the chance to humble the sheriff who dared to bring law to their playground. 23 men rode into Redemption Creek like the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, their horses' hooves drumming against the earth in a rhythm that spoke of violence and retribution. They came expecting to find a sheriff and 3 deputies holed up in a ramshackle jail, easy pickings for men who'd made murder their profession. Instead, they found a town transformed. Thornfield had spent the previous month doing more than just keeping the peace. He'd been building something that hadn't existed in Redemption Creek for longer than anyone could remember: community. The shopkeepers who'd once cowered behind their counters now stood ready with shotguns and rifle barrels bristling from windows. The cowboys who'd once drunk themselves into oblivion every night had sobered up enough to remember what it felt like to have something worth protecting. The banker, the blacksmith, the doctor, even the piano player from the saloon, they'd all answered the call when Thornfield had asked not for deputies, but for citizens willing to defend their home. "This is your last chance, Morrison." Thornfield's voice carried across the street from his position behind an overturned wagon. "Ride out now, and nobody has to die tonight." Morrison's laughter was like the cackle of a hyena over fresh carrion. "You think a few shopkeepers with pea shooters are going to scare us off, Sheriff? We've come to finish what we started." The battle that followed would be talked about in saloons and around campfires for decades to come. It was Sarah McKenna who fired the first shot, her bullet taking down Morrison's lieutenant before he could even clear leather. Tommy Rodriguez moved like liquid death, his twin Colts spitting fire as he danced between cover, each shot finding its mark with supernatural precision. Reverend Stone fought with the righteous fury of an Old Testament prophet, his booming voice calling out prayers and threats in equal measure as his rifle spoke its own kind of gospel. And through it all, Thornfield moved like the eye of a hurricane, calm, controlled, and absolutely lethal. The fight lasted less than 10 minutes, but when the smoke cleared and the echoes of gunfire faded into the desert night, 13 of Morrison's men lay dead in the dust. 8 more had wounds that would remind them for the rest of their lives why challenging the law in Redemption Creek was a mistake they wouldn't make twice. Blacktack Morrison himself lay propped against the water trough, a spreading crimson stain across his chest, and the look of a man who'd finally met something he couldn't intimidate, bribe, or kill. Looks like you won, Sheriff," he wheezed, blood flecking his lips. "But this won't end here. There's always another Morrison, another gang. How long you think you can keep this up?" Thornfield knelt beside the dying outlaw, his voice gentle but firm. "As long as it takes, Jack. As long as it takes." Morrison died with the sunrise, and with him, the last vestige of lawlessness that had plagued Redemption Creek for so long. But Thornfield knew the outlaw's final words carried truth. There would always be another challenge, another test of the peace they'd fought so hard to establish. Word of the Battle of Redemption Creek, as the newspapers would later call it, spread across the territory like wildfire. Within weeks, Thornfield found himself something he'd never expected to be: famous. Reporters arrived from as far away as San Francisco and New York, their notebooks and cameras ready to capture the story of the sheriff who tamed the untamable town. They wrote breathless accounts of his lightning-fast draw, his strategic brilliance, and his ability to inspire ordinary citizens to extraordinary courage. But what truly captured the public imagination wasn't just Thornfield's skill with a gun. It was his vision of what the West could become. In interviews, he spoke not of conquest but of community, not of dominance but of justice tempered with mercy.
"A sheriff's job isn't to be the fastest gun or the toughest fighter," he told a reporter from the Denver Post. "It's to create a place where honest folks can live without fear, where children can play in the streets, and where the rule of law means something more than whoever has the biggest gang." The fame brought its own challenges. Gunfighters began arriving in Redemption Creek with increasing frequency, each one convinced they could be the man to outdraw the legendary Marcus Thornfield. Most were young, hungry for reputation, and doomed to disappointment. Thornfield had learned long ago that the fastest way to end a gunfight was to never let it start. "Son," he would say to each would-be challenger, "I can see you're fast, and I respect that. But speed without wisdom is just a quick way to an early grave. This town's got plenty of work for a man with your skills if you're willing to use them for something besides proving how tough you are." More often than not, the young guns found themselves wearing deputy badges instead of eating dirt, transformed from potential threats into protectors of the peace they'd come to disturb. It was a strategy that both frustrated his enemies and amazed his allies. But it worked. Sarah McKenna had become something of a legend herself, the first woman deputy who could outshoot most men and outthink nearly all of them. She'd taken over much of the administrative work that kept the sheriff's office running, organizing patrols, managing the jail, and somehow finding time to teach reading and writing to anyone in town who wanted to learn. Tommy Rodriguez had evolved from a reformed gunslinger into something approaching a detective, his intimate knowledge of criminal behavior making him invaluable in preventing crimes before they happened. He could spot a con artist from 100 yards away and smell a cattle rustling operation before the first cow went missing. Reverend Stone had become the moral compass of the operation, the man who reminded them all that justice without mercy was just vengeance in disguise. His Sunday sermons drew crowds from across the territory, and his weekday counseling sessions had helped more than one reformed outlaw find a path to honest living. Together, they transformed not just Redemption Creek, but the entire region. Other towns began requesting their help, and soon Thornfield found himself appointed as a territorial marshal, responsible for maintaining law and order across a territory larger than most eastern states. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, carried by a rider whose horse was lathered with sweat and whose eyes held the kind of fear that came from seeing something no man should have to see. "Marshal Thornfield," the message read,
Urgent assistance required. Stop. Devil's Canyon overrun by Comancheros. Stop. Town of Esperanza under siege. Stop. Women and children in immediate danger. Please advise. Stop. Sheriff William Hayes. Stop. Devil's Canyon was 3 days' hard ride from Redemption Creek, through some of the most unforgiving territory in the Southwest. The Comancheros who operated there weren't just outlaws. They were a fusion of the worst elements of several cultures. Traders who dealt in stolen goods, kidnapped women, and death itself. Esperanza was a peaceful farming community of barely 300 souls, mostly Mexican families who'd been working the same land for generations. They had no chance against the kind of force that could take Devil's Canyon. "We ride in an hour," Thornfield announced to his deputies. "Full gear, extra ammunition, and provisions for a week." "Just the 4 of us?" Tommy asked, checking his weapons with practiced efficiency. "The 4 of us and anyone else in this town brave enough to risk their lives for people they've never met," Thornfield replied. "Because that's what makes us different from the scum we fight. We protect the innocent, even when they're not our innocent." By the time they were ready to ride, 23 men had volunteered to join the expedition. They were shopkeepers and cowboys, farmers and former outlaws, united by the belief that some things were worth fighting for even when the odds were impossibly long. The ride to Devil's Canyon was a nightmare of heat, dust, and the constant knowledge that they were heading into a trap that could easily become their tomb. But Thornfield had learned something important during his years of keeping the peace. Sometimes the only way to stop evil was to ride straight at it with everything you had and hope that justice and courage could overcome superior numbers and better positioning. They reached the outskirts of Esperanza just as the sun was setting, painting the sky the color of blood and fire. The town was under siege, surrounded by more than 60 Comancheros who turned the peaceful farming community into their own personal kingdom of terror. "We're outnumbered almost 3 to 1, Sarah observed, studying the enemy positions through her field glasses. "Then we'll have to be 3 times as smart," Thornfield replied. "Tommy, I want you to take half the men and circle around to the north. Create a distraction. Make them think that's where the main attack is coming from. Reverend, you and the other half come with me. We're going straight up the middle." "And me?" Sarah asked. Thornfield handed her a stick of dynamite and a coil of fuse. "You, my dear deputy, are going to give them something to really worry about." The Battle of Esperanza began with the kind of explosion that could be heard in 3 counties. Sarah McKenna had managed to get close enough to the Comancheros' ammunition depot to plant her charges, and when they went off, the blast lit up the night sky like a second sunrise. In the chaos that followed, Thornfield's plan unfolded with military precision. Tommy Rodriguez and his men attacked from the north, their guns blazing as they drove the enemy back from the town's outer defenses. The Comancheros, thinking they were facing the main assault, rushed reinforcements to meet this threat. That's when Thornfield and Reverend Stone led their charge straight through the center of the enemy lines. It was the kind of bold, desperate maneuver that should have ended in massacre. But Thornfield had learned something important about the criminal mind during his years of fighting it. Bullies were cowards at heart, and cowards broke when faced with truly fearless opposition. The Comancheros had been expecting to face terrified farmers armed with pitchforks and prayers. Instead, they found themselves confronting hardened lawmen who fought with the kind of controlled fury that came from years of protecting the innocent against impossible odds. Thornfield moved through the battle like an avenging angel, his twin Colts speaking death to anyone who stood between him and the captured townspeople. Beside him, Reverend Stone fought with his rifle in one hand and his Bible in the other, his booming voice calling out passages from Ecclesiastes about there being a time for peace and a time for war. The fighting was vicious and close, the kind of combat where men could see the fear in their enemies' eyes before pulling the trigger. Buildings burned, bullets shattered windows, and the night air filled with smoke and screams, and the particular smell of violence that never quite left the man's memory. But slowly, impossibly, the tide began to turn. The Comancheros, faced with an enemy that refused to break or retreat, began to lose their taste for the fight. First one, then several, then entire groups began to fall back, then run, then scatter like leaves before a hurricane. By dawn, it was over. The Comancheros who weren't dead or wounded had fled into the desert, leaving behind their stolen goods, their weapons, and their reputation for invincibility. Esperanza was free, its people rescued, and another chapter had been added to the growing legend of Marcus Iron Thornfield. But victory had come at a cost. 7 of Thornfield's volunteers had been killed in the fighting, and twice that many wounded. Among the wounded was Tommy Rodriguez, who'd taken a bullet in the chest while leading his men against impossible odds. "Did we win, Sheriff?" Tommy whispered as Thornfield knelt beside him in the town's makeshift hospital. "We won, son. The people are safe, the bad guys are gone, and you fought like a hero." Tommy managed a weak smile. "Feels different than I thought it would, being on the right side of the law." "How's that?" "Hurts more when you get shot, but it's worth it when you see the kids playing in the streets again." Tommy Rodriguez died 2 days later, but not before extracting a promise from Thornfield to tell his story to anyone who would listen. The story of a young gunslinger who'd found redemption in service to something greater than himself.
The years that followed brought both triumph and tragedy to Marcus Thornfield and his unlikely band of lawmen. They cleaned up towns across the territory, broke up criminal organizations that had operated with impunity for decades, and slowly but surely brought the rule of law to places where it had never existed before. But fame, Thornfield learned, was a double-edged sword that cut both ways. The legend of Iron Thornfield had grown with each successful operation, each dramatic showdown, each impossible victory against overwhelming odds. Dime novels began appearing with his name on the cover, filled with lurid tales that bore only passing resemblance to the truth. He was credited with feats of marksmanship that defied physics, acts of heroism that bordered on the supernatural, and the personal body count that would have required him to kill someone every day for 20 years. The reality was both more mundane and more complex. Yes, he was fast with a gun, faster than most men had any right to be. Yes, he was brave, intelligent, and absolutely committed to his vision of justice. But he was also a man who bled when shot, who made mistakes that sometimes cost lives, and who went to sleep every night haunted by the faces of good people he hadn't been able to save. The weight of living up to his own legend began to take its toll. He found himself drinking more, sleeping less, and pushing himself harder with each new challenge. Sarah McKenna, now his chief deputy and the closest thing he had to family, watched with growing concern as the man she'd come to respect above all others slowly wore himself down in service to an ideal that demanded everything and gave back only more responsibility. "Marcus," she said one evening as they sat on the porch of the sheriff's office, watching the sunset over a town that had become everything they dreamed it could be, "when was the last time you took a day off? Just one day where you weren't Marshall Thornfield, the legend, but just Marcus, the man." He considered the question for a long time before answering. "Can't remember, Sarah. Seems like every time I think about slowing down, another town needs help, another group of innocents needs protecting. How do you walk away from that?" "You don't," she replied gently, "but you also don't let it destroy you. Because if you do, what happens to all the people counting on you to be there when they need you most?" Her words proved prophetic when the telegram arrived 3 weeks later. It was from the governor himself, requesting Thornfield's immediate assistance with what the message described as a situation of territorial importance. The situation turned out to be the Sanderson Gang, a collection of the most vicious outlaws ever assembled under one leadership. They'd taken over the silver mining town of Silver Falls and were holding the entire population hostage while they systematically looted everything of value. What made the situation particularly dangerous was the gang's leader, Clayton Sanderson, Thornfield's own brother. The Thornfield brothers had taken different paths 20 years earlier when their father's ranch had been burned out by raiders and their family scattered to the winds.
Marcus had chosen the badge, the long road of building something better from the ashes of violence. Clayton had chosen the gun, the quick money, and the kind of life that burned bright and fast before consuming everything it touched. Now they faced each other across the main street of Silver Falls, two middle-aged men whose choices had led them to this moment of inevitable confrontation. Clayton still looked like the handsome younger brother Marcus remembered, but his eyes held the cold emptiness of a man who'd killed so often that death had become just another business transaction. "Well, well," Clayton called out, his voice carrying the mocking tone that had driven Marcus to distraction when they were children. "If it isn't my famous big brother, come to save the day again. You always did think you were better than the rest of us, Marcus. Always had to be the hero." "Let the people go, Clay," Thornfield replied, his hand resting easily on his gun but not yet drawing. "Whatever's between us, they don't deserve to be part of it."
Clayton laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Oh, but they do, brother. They're my insurance policy. My guarantee that the great Marcus Thornfield won't just come riding in with guns blazing. You see, I know you too well. You won't risk innocent lives just to take me down." "You're right," Thornfield said quietly. "I won't, but I will make you a deal." "I'm listening." "Single combat, just you and me, winner takes all. If you kill me, my people ride out and leave you to your business. If I kill you, your gang surrenders and the hostages go free." Clayton's grin was like the expression of a shark that had just smelled blood in the water. "You always were too honorable for your own good, Marcus. That's what's going to get you killed." The duel that followed was unlike any of the dramatic showdowns that had made Thornfield famous. There were no speeches, no crowds gathering to watch, no sense of righteous justice about to triumph over evil. There were just two brothers who'd chosen different paths, and only one would walk away. They stood 30 paces apart in the dusty street, the afternoon sun casting their shadows long and dark across the ground. For a moment that stretched like eternity, neither man moved, each reading the other's intentions in the subtle shift of stance, the slight tensing of muscle, the barely perceptible change in breathing that preceded action. Clayton drew first, his hand moving with the fluid speed of a man who'd killed dozens in fair fights and twice that many in unfair ones. But he was facing his brother, the man who taught him how to shoot in the first place, and Marcus Thornfield had learned a few things in the 20 years since they'd last seen each other. The two shots sounded almost like one, their reports echoing off the buildings like thunder. For a moment, both men stood frozen, smoke rising from their weapons. Then Clayton stumbled, looked down at the spreading crimson stain across his chest, and fell to his knees. "Damn," he whispered as Marcus knelt beside him. "You always were faster than me." "Clay, No." Clayton raised a shaking hand. "Don't say you're sorry. We both knew this was how it would end. I chose my path, and you chose yours. Just tell me it was worth it. All the blood, all the pain, all the people we couldn't save. Tell me it was worth it." Thornfield looked around at the town they just freed, at the faces peering out from windows and doorways, at the children who would now be able to play in the streets without fear. It was worth it, Clay. It was all worth it. Clayton Sanderson died with his brother's name on his lips, and the sun setting behind them like the end of an era. Marcus Iron Thornfield served as a territorial marshal for 15 more years, bringing law and order to countless communities across the American Southwest. He never married, though his relationship with Sarah McKenna evolved into something deeper than partnership and more enduring than romance, a bond forged in fire and tempered by shared purpose. He trained dozens of deputies, many of whom went on to become legendary lawmen themselves. He established the first formal law enforcement academy in the territory, ensuring that future generations of peace officers would be prepared for the challenges they'd face. He wrote extensively about law enforcement techniques, criminal psychology, and the importance of community involvement in maintaining order. But perhaps his greatest legacy was the example he set. That one person, armed with courage, intelligence, and an unwavering commitment to justice, could make a difference in the world. That civilization wasn't something that simply happened, but something that had to be built and defended by ordinary people willing to do extraordinary things.
When he finally died in 1905, peacefully in his sleep at the age of 74, the entire territory mourned. Flags flew at half-mast, churches held memorial services, and newspapers across the country ran lengthy obituaries celebrating the life of the man who tamed the untamable West. His funeral was attended by thousands, including former outlaws who turned their lives around after encounters with the legendary sheriff, families whose lives he'd saved, and fellow lawmen who'd been inspired by his example. Sarah McKenna, now an old woman herself, but still sharp as a razor, delivered the eulogy. "Marcus Thornfield," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent crowd, "was not the fastest gun in the West, though he was fast enough. He was not the toughest fighter, though he was tough enough. He was not the smartest man, though he was smart enough. What he was, what made him truly great, was a man who understood that being a legend isn't about what people say about you after you're gone. It's about what you do for people while you're still here." Today, more than a century later, the legend of Marcus "Iron" Thornfield continues to inspire new generations of peace officers, writers, and anyone who believes that justice, tempered with mercy and seasoned with courage, can still triumph over the forces of chaos and evil. In Redemption Creek, now a thriving city of 50,000, a bronze statue stands in the center of town square. It depicts a tall man in a worn hat and weathered duster, a badge gleaming on his chest, and his hand resting easily on his gun. The inscription reads simply, "Marcus Thornfield, 1831-1905. He brought law to the lawless and hope to the hopeless. His legend lives on." And in the hearts of those who still believe that right can triumph over might, that courage can overcome cowardice, and that one person willing to stand up for what's right can change the world, the legend of Iron Thornfield lives on indeed. Some say that on quiet nights, when the desert wind whispers through the streets of the towns he once protected, you can still hear the echo of his voice, reminding us all that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, and the cost of justice is everything we're willing to give. The West may have been won, but the fight for justice, the struggle to protect the innocent, and the battle to build something better from the ashes of what came before, that fight continues in every generation, carried forward by those brave enough to pin on a badge and stand between the darkness and the light.